Hi, this is Melissa Wiltrow, and this is my Module 9 assignment for AEP 855, the case study narrative. So firstly is a summary of the facts. We know that Mr. Inman is the assistant principal at Rocket Junior High, and he had taken an interest in a group of students from the South Side who had been getting into trouble. One particular student was James, and when he heard that James had been tardy to 3 classes this certain day, he decided to call him to the office. And while he was in the process of developing a plan to talk to James, fifth hour teacher calls and says that she saw James pass an item to honor student David in the hallway. So Mr. Inman decides to call both boys in at the same time. Fifth hour teacher assumed that what was being passed was drugs, and she passed that message along to Mr. Inman over the phone. And so Mr. Inman assumed that she knew what she was talking about, and he also prepared for the instance of this being a drug interaction. So he called in a police officer. All 3 of these individuals were in the office with Mr. Inman, and he questioned them at the same time. He conducted a search and found that it was brass knuckles, a prohibited weapon, and so both boys were arrested. They were taken to the jail immediately, and parents were contacted afterward to inform them that their children had been arrested and that there was a consequence of at least a 45-day suspension from this school to the alternative school to the DAEP program. James's mom seemed to be accepting of this and thought it might teach him a lesson, whereas David's mother was very upset. The fact that James admitted while being interrogated that he had bullied David into holding this weapon for him so that he could use it later on another person changed Mr. Inman's thought process. He felt conflicted about whether or not he should actually file paperwork for David to punish him from the school policy of the 45-day minimum suspension. That decision does not affect the law and the fact that these boys were arrested. So some of the instances that we need to discuss are harm, law, harassment, and discrimination. I believe that the primary harm has been caused toward David and his family. David was set up for success by the school, and this instance has potentially set him up for failure if, in fact, he was bullied and is being wrongfully accused of something that he just genuinely didn't know how to handle. It is clear that he didn't know his rights or he was afraid to report it. He did not advocate for himself, and having known those rights, I do believe that he would have been more willing to report this weapon because he was in possession of it, which means that he did commit a crime. His family is hurt emotionally, and they will have to manage David, and they will have to ensure that he does not go down a bad path. The law was broken. In the case study, it says the officer had to take both students to jail and charge them with felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. They broke a law, both boys. Regardless of Inman's decision, as I said, to submit this paperwork, the boys have been charged with a felony. Now, whether or not the court decides to follow through with David's punishment, we don't know. But James did commit a crime and intended to commit a second one by using the weapon later that day. So his punishment, we don't really have much that we can change on that. I do believe that Inman's decision to throw away the DAEP paperwork for David is a violation of his contract, which is essentially a violation of law. When you sign that contract, you are committing to those things in your handbook, the policies put in place, and so he did violate that contract, and he is playing favorites here. Now, is this equitable? That is something that we have to address in this case as well. I do believe that the director of secondary education did harass Mr. Inman slightly. He threatened his job. He threatened a written reprimand if he did not submit this paperwork. This is a first-year assistant principal. The head principal is nowhere to be found in this scenario, and so I believe that a conversation needed to be had, an overview of the policies, some sort of collaboration to handle this situation versus a threat. And lastly, I do believe that James was discriminated against because he is a student who happens to be associated with a bad group, and when the fifth hour teacher saw him in the hall passing something along, she assumed the worst of him. She assumed that it was drugs. She had no proof that it was drugs. She made an accusation that caused both of these boys to be put in a horrible situation, and so that cannot happen. It was her preconceived notion of him as a person that led her to do this, even though he had been making progress. To synthesize this whole case in one sentence, I would say that Mr. Inman was required to make a leadership decision without the support of the school's head principal, in which a violation of law turned into a perplexing issue of poor ethics. I do believe that if the head principal had maybe done a better job of modeling ethical decision making, then Mr. Inman would not have made the poor choices that he made that day. The students involved are James and David that we know of. There could be others involved in this case. We are unsure. James is 15, David is 13. They are both males. They are both from the South Side. James is known to be a tough kid. He's tattooed. And David is known to be a quiet kid who plays in the band and is in honors classes. The teacher involved is James's fifth hour teacher. She's the female and nondescript. The parents involved were the mothers. James's mother did not seem to be surprised. She hoped that he would learn from this consequence and that finally he would get his life together. And David's mom took action. She went to the school, she cried, she went to the police. I seriously doubt that she is going to let this go. She is a stakeholder who will take this to the top, and she believes that her son does not deserve the same consequences as James. The administration involved is Mr. Inman, who is, again, new at his job, cares a lot about building relationships with students, and the director, who seems harsh and does do things by the book. The place is the school, which we know has 900 students, so we can assume that it's large. In the case study, it says the system was broken and that the DAEP is referred to as a hellhole. That's all we really know about the conditions of the school, but knowing that it's large, we can assume there is a diverse population here. The little facts that we know don't really let us know what the location is, but I doubt that it's rural because it is so large. But we know that Mr. Inman is from the South Side as well, and that he went to college and was successful enough to become an administrator. This is referred to as a junior high, which makes me believe that it is a middle school, ages 11 to 14, 6th through 8th grade. So I might assume that James has been held back, especially because he's interacting with a 13-year-old. Are they in the same class? We don't really know. We don't know anything about the curriculum taught. All we know is that the DAEP program does not seem to be positively perceived. To review and prioritize the situation and the stakeholders, I do think that most of the stakeholders have been contacted, the ones that should be contacted, and I do believe that harm has been done. The ones with the most important stake are David, his family, and Mr. Inman, because the choice that Mr. Inman makes next will directly affect them. But regardless, James admitted to holding the weapon, it being his, and to wanting to use it on another person. So his admission doesn't change the facts of the case. He broke a law and he has to serve the consequences. So the final decision doesn't really apply to him. All stakeholders have not been consulted because the head principal, again, is not part of this. I do think that he needs to be, and we don't really have a lot of answers. Who was James intending to approach? If it was going to be someone at school, that's important. That student needs to be looked after so that when James comes back, we don't just go through this whole process again. So I do have many unanswered questions. Primarily, where is this principal? Laws were broken. There were poor ethical decisions made. And even though we have talked about the difference between law and ethics, they don't always connect in certain situations. I do believe that the handling of James in particular had to be done that way, not in front of another student. That shouldn't have happened, but he did break a law. The big dilemma here is equity, and I also believe that the rights of individuals have been compromised. Harm has been done, and I do believe that I would know enough to make a decision in this situation. I cannot see myself taking zero actions. There are too many legal implications to this. Taking no action is action. And I do believe that with the weapon being used, it could have been a student, and then we would have more legal harm done here. But if you are a leader, you need to model ethical behavior, and making a zero decision is not modeling ethical behavior. If I were going to be comprehensive, I would have talked to the fifth hour teacher for more follow-up. She probably should have stopped the kids in the hall when she saw it and had a conversation with him. I don't know if she was teaching a class at that time or if she had a moment to step out. I would have talked to the boys individually, and only after that would I have held them and called the police to handle the situation. I think that I would have handled the situations differently. I would be interested in knowing if the stories match. I would ensure that parents were contacted before the boys were arrested and sent to jail. and I would have filed the paperwork as per my job. My liberal decision isn't much different. I don't think that being liberal means that you aren't going to take it seriously. I think it means that you're taking into consideration everyone's feelings and how this will impact them directly. And so I would have communicated with everyone involved, gotten a real sense of what is happening here, and trying to figure out, was David an innocent bystander? Was he truly bullied into holding this weapon, or was James just protecting him? And they're both responsible because we actually don't know that. We are assuming that because David is a typically good student, that he's just telling the truth. But to do that is to cast our preconceived notions on those both groups of boys, and it's possible that David was just as involved. The strategies that I may use are to fall on my sword, do not submit that paperwork, and take the consequence. If he's truly innocent, I think that that may be a plausible next step. He has started to develop relationships with these students, and if he does that, then he would continue to cultivate that relationship and model what he believes is right and wrong to his students and staff. The next option is to, question David again. Is he going to change his story or not? And then lastly is to get the head principal involved and follow suit, because this person obviously has been there longer, has dealt with these students, and may have a better solution to this problem. Option 1, pros, David would be protected, and I would demonstrate to students, staff, and faculty, parents as well, that students are my top priority. I would be modeling ethical behavior in this choice. The cons are that I would have a reprimand on my file and that I might be terminated. The teacher may feel slighted, the one that reported James. My relationship with James may be compromised because I betrayed him and protected another student. I may appear to play favorites, and that could lead to others perceiving me as an unethical decision maker. Option 2, gaining more knowledge to question David again. Pros, I would learn more if he was really involved. I may feel that I could make a better choice. I may be able to protect David, but the cons are that I could learn nothing new. And I may find out that James wasn't entirely at fault, and then I'm more conflicted on what to do. Option 3 is to consult the head principal. Pros are that he or she would likely provide an unbiased answer to this problem, and that they would know more about the legal and ethical implications of my next step. Another pro is that they may tell me what to do, and I may just have to follow that. And so that stress of having to make the decision myself would be off of my back. The cons are that the head principal may reprimand me anyway. They may make the choice that I feel is unethical, and also they may view James as a thug because they may not have a relationship with him. And so a harsher decision could be decided on. The best option, in my opinion, is to consult the head principal. I believe that in considering that person and consulting with the board and the parents, communicating, coming to a best interest decision would be plausible. I think back to the articles you read about the PLUS system that you want to follow. Evaluate your decision afterwards, make sure you've made the right one, involve the stakeholders, and if all else fails, then you circle back, try to decide on something else. A creative option that I had was maybe ask the students, David in particular, what he thought his punishment should be, or ask the board for an alternate punishment. And in implementing my decision, I took this part of the assignment as, the damage has been done, what would you do next? So I would consult the board and ask for a lesser punishment for David. I still think that he should be punished. And so my steps are to consult the board with the head principal, contact David's parents, submit the paperwork either with the lesser punishment or with the full punishment, and then lastly, talk to the teachers about how they should be handling situations like this, and maybe even have some sort of conference with the students about their rights and knowing that they need to report things. I would need to ensure that whatever decision is made, the parents are fully aware, because if worst case scenario happens, David's family will be directly affected. The other students do not need to know the details of this incident. In fact, that is against the law, and if an administrator chose to do that, they would be violating the law. I think that if I could go and change the situation, the law would still need to be involved. It already is involved, but I would not have involved it until I had spoken to the boys, as mentioned earlier, and I would likely involve the law for James. David, I don't believe I would have contacted the police about. However, it is a crime not to report a crime, and so if you're in the situation as an administrator, you have things that you have to live up to. It is the expectation that is set in place. I would never threaten a student. I think that explaining their rights and advocating for them and telling them that there are consequences for their actions will help them be responsible and ethical. And it is important that we consider the well-being of all involved. That is it, and thank you for watching. This was my Module 9.